Now we're going to follow up with some questions, and I'll try to highlight some important points in your presentations. My first keyword is strategy. Of course, these three regional players, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they have followed a kind of different strategy, and it may be interesting to try to compare them a little bit. First, if you can start with Saudi Arabia, you mentioned, Bjørn Olav, that the Arab Spring was a kind of earthquake. It was something that the regime hated, and you described two phases. First one, which the regime tried to counter revolution, to counter the Arab Spring, and then they tried to modernize their own regime because they realized that they had to do something in order to keep control. In that sense, it was a kind of, the Arab Spring had a kind of positive impact. Still, you mentioned it may be a kind of a risky change. Could you explain a little bit about that?
I can try. First of all, I would say, yeah, a positive impact in the sense that there are some aspects of this modernization project that are positive. Obviously, a simple thing that women can drive cars, but also the relaxation of some of the cultural restrictions, and more specifically the restrictions on women. So there are positive aspects, but there are also very negative aspects, because the freedom of discussion, of organizing anything, is less than ever, and that says a lot in Saudi Arabia. But when I say the risky part of the strategy, it's twofold. One, as I tried to explain, is the external one, is that when you project military power directly, you become much more vulnerable to resistance, and you lose a lot in reputation. That's one thing, but also Saudi Arabia's strength internally, except for money, but are not necessarily that how do you say, sustainable. So that's one thing. Internally, I mean that there are we have a lot of example in history of modern autocratic rulers deciding that it's time that they have to move for change, like the Shah in Iran is the most immediate comes to mind, because we're talking about this region, and whether it started in the 30s, but definitely in the 60s and 70s was rapid modernization and rapid changes taking place in Iranian society, which brought forth, well, we think a lot about the mullahs, of course, that's one thing, because it stirred cultural conflicts in the country with this rapid modernization, but it also produced a huge working class and a modern middle class, which was very important in toppling the Shah, when they in the 70s, from the mid 70s, went into opposition. So same kind of things might happen in Saudi Arabia. There's an emergent big middle class who wants more than watching cinema, wants more than having a reasonable income, wants to influence things. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia remains a religious country, and it's not an easy deal to move away from this very strict religious regime that they had, and it will stir a lot of conflicts. So it is these reforms are destabilizing, and to succeed, at least they would have to succeed tremendously in the economic terms, but it's not clear that they will do so.
Yes, thank you. If we turn to the Iranian regime then, Kjetil, as you mentioned, they welcomed the Arab Spring, but they call it maybe the Islamic awakening. They tried to exploit the uprisings and were very active all over the place, in Syria, in Lebanon, Libya, and Yemen. But you made a special case of Syria because they had a very much dilemma, and they ended up in supporting Assad regime. Would you, if you sum up here, would you say that this is kind of a success for the point of view of the Tehran regime?
In a sense, it is. I mean, who would have thought that the Syrian regime would survive? I mean, it looked really bad from Iran's point of view. Like the entire region, the entire world was against it. It was only Iran and, eventually Russia. I think they showed that it mattered more to them than it mattered to. They were prepared to sacrifice more than the other side's supporters. Like Saudi Arabia, yes, it was supportive of the Syrian opposition, but it had a lot of hesitation. Wasn't that sure about these Islamist forces winning the country. Weren't really that convinced. Iran knew what it wanted and it went for it. But when I talk in these terms and I say Iran knew what it wanted, I'm not really doing justice to the heterogeneity of views inside Iran. And I should say that compared to Pinar and Bjørn Olav, I have not been as good as laying out the internal tensions and contradictions that underlie this regional policy. Because Iran has its own tensions, and the regime of, if you call it Khamenei's regime, Khamenei has been the leader of Iran since 1989. For as long as he has been the leader of Iran, there has been a constant push for reform inside Iran and push of tuning down these tensions, tuning down these revolutionary movements, stop engaging in these regional battles. And Khamenei's survival policy strategy has been to keep these confrontations alive. There's no doubt about that. He has been thriving on a state of tensions with the outside world, because as long as Iran is under attack by the entire world, led by the United States, it's very hard to argue for, reform and democracy inside Iran, and priority has to be the country's security, and so you can strike down on internal opposition. And you have these tensions between, for the past 8 years, you have these tensions between the Revolutionary Guards and the presidency of Rouhani, who has been engaging for taking down these conflicts, engagement with the West. This has been a real battle inside Iran, and of course, the Revolutionary Guards has strengthened its internal position because of everything that's going on in the Arab world, Syria included. And that's why it is worrying that Iran finds that Rouhani and what he stands for finds himself in this discredited state inside Iran. It is deeply worrying for what may come in the longer run.
Thank you. And we turn to Turkey. Pinar, Mr. Erdogan, he has had great ambitions for Turkey and like to make Turkey a bigger role for Turkey in the region. Somebody calls him the new Sultan, and he talks about the Ottoman Empire. How would you evaluate his foreign policy efforts? I know it's a big question, but still.
In terms of their success?
Yeah.
Well, at the moment, Turkey is in this quagmire in Syria, and it is, it's engaged in processes that it sometimes overreaches. But in many ways, if you look at the period in which Erdogan has been in power from 2002 to the present, and you look at Turkey before 2002, Turkey, when Erdogan came to power, was a country that was in economic decline. It had its hand in its hat and was knocking at the door of the European Union. And much of the reason why Erdogan came to power in 2002 was this dissatisfaction with the way Turkey was also, there was no pride in being Turkish. Erdogan has brought pride back to Turkey, which is, it has made Turkey a country to deal with both regionally, but also globally. I mean, another aspect of his foreign policy that we haven't really discussed here is this aspiration to become a humanitarian power, which, given what's happening internally in the country, is, of course, an enormous contradiction. So on many levels, his foreign policy has succeeded in putting Turkey on the map, but it's had many failures along the way. And yet he's able to pick himself up and turn around. And he is, above all, a pragmatist. So some of these alliances that we see him making and breaking are alliances based on this pragmatic need to promote Turkish power in the region and as a rising global actor.
If we continue with another keyword, United States of America, it's a kind of an elephant in the room in a way. As you know, the relationship between US and Turkey is very strained, and because of the friendship between Turkey and Russia, between Erdogan and Putin. I understand they are quite close friends, in fact. And you have described this relationship as transactional. It is not that, I find it quite easy to understand what's in it for Putin, but what's in it for Erdogan and Turkey?
I think Erdogan leverages his relationship to Putin as to gain concessions other places, and also to put Turkey on the map. Turkey is now playing in the big league because it's included in this kind of marriage of convenience or transactional alliance, if you like, with Russia. And also, Erdogan has benefited, I think, to a certain extent from the policy of the U.S. administration under Trump, which has he's been able to use it to his advantage. I think now with the Biden administration, it'll be harder for him to do that, not least because there's more of a connection between the White House and the State Department, and policy will be formed, not on the spur of the moment or through Twitter, and just in a reactionary way. So I think that the new policy coming from the Biden administration will be something that Erdogan will perhaps have a harder time using his strongman tactics against, not least because the Biden administration has already signaled that questions of democracy and governance will be much more important to them than they were to the Trump administration. So I think that what is it what's the relationship to Russia? I think it has been to put Turkey on the map. It has been to be able to leverage that relationship vis-a-vis others as well.
Kjetil, the big question, of course, concerning U.S. and Iran is the nuclear deal, and it's not that easy match. It's quite a delicate matter. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes, it's the big question now with Iran, because as you know, President Biden made it clear during his campaign that he wanted to reintegrate the JCPOA and criticize Trump's withdrawal from it and the maximum pressure campaign. And that raised a lot of expectations in Iran that, as soon as he's in power, things will get resolved. Now, we're soon 2 months in his presidency, and we see that things are not that easy. They're not going to be that easy. there's a lot of debate in the US, saying that, okay, President Trump built up a lot of leverage for us. His sanctions campaign was maybe not that justified, but look, we have got all this pressure on Iran, we have to use it. And now we should use it to make a better deal. We should, include what was not a part of the GCPOA, the first, which is kind of the missile program of Iran and its regional activities. And Biden, and especially some of his advisors' role, has been to say that, we should first just go back to GCPOA, and then that will be a goodwill measure, and we'll build on that. We'll tackle the other questions as they come. And nonetheless, we see that, there's this pressure from the Congress. Congressmen there was a bipartisan letter saying that, Biden should use this opportunity to make a more comprehensive deal, as they say. And so Biden he's made some goodwill measures, but he's done nothing on sanctions so far, which from the Iranian point of view is outrageous, because, from their point of view, the US breaking with the GCPOA was just completely illegitimate. Here was an international agreement ratified by the Security Council, and then all of a sudden just President Trump finds out, I don't want to stick to this, and I'll go for it. The very contrary, impose harsh sanctions against Iran in the middle of COVID-19. So the Iranians feel completely betrayed by the entire international community. And then they say, okay, we're 2 months into this presidency and still we have all the sanctions. And now both sides are saying that, the other side should go first, because Iran has stepped back from part of its commitment to the GCPOA, progressively enriching more uranium to higher degrees, stockpiling more uranium, using more advanced centrifuges. The Iranian parliament has passed legislation that would force the government to reduce access to international observers of the nuclear program. So kind of just as the Congress has made it difficult for a president of the US to integrate the deal, the Iranian parliament in a sense is doing the same thing. So there's a worrying situation, and right now it seems like the US is saying, okay, we're giving these signals that we want to go back to the agreement, but we would like to see similar signals coming out of Iran. But Iran is not currently giving these signals. Iran is now saying that, this has to be a simple matter. The US goes back to its commitment and will comply completely. We're not going to negotiate now. If we had wanted to negotiate, we would have negotiated with Trump. We reject this idea that there can be a better deal. There's the GCPOA and that's it. You take it or you leave it. This is the GCPOA. And the upcoming elections in Iran is complicating matters as well. Because soon there is a lot of politics in this. And maybe some actors in Iran don't really want to give Rouhani the pressure of fixing the Iranian economy. Maybe they'd like that to be a hardline president elected in June who comes to get the honor of fixing the economy. Then again, the question is, will a hardline president in Iran actually want to reintegrate into the nuclear agreement at all? So it's really an open question. I mean, the two sides agree that the GCPOA is a good thing and that the Trump maximum pressure campaign was illegitimate. But now the devil is in the detail, and there's a lot of posturing.
Yeah, very exciting. back to Saudi Arabia. They're all friends with the United States, of course, but still there are quite harsh criticism these days from the Biden administration. And the bigger question is, of course, that the United States is kind of retreating from the Middle East, from Syria, from Afghanistan, and they're not that dependent of the oil from Saudi Arabia. Bjørn Olav, what would you say? What do you expect from the relationship between Biden administration and the Saudi regime now?
I may be wrong, but I don't expect any sort of rapid major change. The U.S. sent a signal when they released this report that pointed to MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, as responsible for the Khashoggi killing. But the Americans are gradually retreating, but still Saudi Arabia is important. The Middle East is still important for strategic reasons. Saudi Arabia is still important because an important aspect of the situation is that the countries that in the Arab world traditionally were the strong powers that sort of balance these rich oil monarchies, states like Egypt more than anything, but also Egypt, Syria, Iraq, they have all sort of more or less collapsed on themselves. I mean, Egypt is controlled by a military regime, but it is absorbed in its own internal economic and political problems. So it's an ally for Saudi Arabia, but it's rather a dependency on Saudi Arabia. So, meaning that for some years to come, probably the Saudis and the Emiratis will continue to have a sort of leadership or being driving forces in the region, and then the US. That's why the US will not go so far. They will have a more critical distance than before, but they will keep the relation. In the phase just after the uprisings of 2011, the US were testing out new possible partners or contacts. They had contact with the Muslim Brothers in Egypt, for example, or so on. But nowadays there are no sort of credible major forces that could be an alternative just for the moment. On the other hand, as I tried to describe, in a little bit longer run, I think that the role of Saudi Arabia is on rather weak foundations. I mean, Iran and Turkey will remain, I'm quite sure, as major powers in the region. Saudi Arabia, that's more shaky. And as and also it didn't have success. It did not have success in forcing Qatar into place. Its efforts in Yemen and Syria is not, and in Libya are not going anywhere. There might be a pushback, and as I said, the Arab Spring is still alive. In Algeria, there are ongoing big demonstrations in that major oil country. But so sort of any shift in one of the major Arab countries in renewed push for democracy could send things moving also in the Gulf. So.
Thank you. If we could continue a little bit about another aspect here, the internal problems in all these three countries, and we can continue with Saudi Arabia. Of course, they experience some kind of modernization and a little bit of taste of freedom, but you don't expect things to boil in the short run, I guess. But you also mentioned the oil price and how important the oil price is. If you get a big drop in the oil price, let's say next 5-10 years, what can you expect in Saudi Arabia? Will it boil more?
I think that still Saudi Arabia has huge financial reserves, but they have been dropping quite rapidly in the period from 2014 with the low oil price. If we get into another period like that, Saudi Arabia, things have happened already. Saudi Arabia has introduced indirect taxes, which have made some goods more expensive for the population. Saudi Arabia is also not, it's not sort of stone rich as Qatar or Abu Dhabi. And there's a high living standard for the population in general, but there are also poor sections even within the Saudi citizen population. And if a reduced oil price leads to more taxes, less jobs for the Saudi population, then that would, I think, might well trigger unrest, because there are, and then if unrest is triggered, there are forces in place now. There are a lot of them are in jail at the moment. That's true, but there are tendencies, for example, within the wide Islamic leaning or Islamist leaning circles inside the Saudi middle class. There is already in place ideologues, programmatic or programs calling for constitutional monarchy, for participation. So the combination of this, that the oppositional forces are there, and then if the economic situation creates more dissatisfaction, things might move faster than we think. I don't see it immediately forthcoming, but with it, if there was to be a sustained period of low oil prices, yes.
Well, Iran is also in a difficult situation, and as you mentioned, there are going to be election in June. What is at stake, Kjetil?
Well, many things are at stake. Starting, as I said, with the nuclear agreement, the fact that a recent public opinion poll in Iran showed that support of the JCPOA had fallen from about 76%, I think, at the time it was agreed, to around 50% now, showing strong popular support for the hardline measures voted by the parliament, saying that we should keep increasing our pressure, we should reducing our commitment to nuclear agreement until the US abides by its obligations. And as I said, there's a real possibility that that we may not get back to the nuclear agreement, and that's for sure going to create huge problems, because Iran continuing nuclear enrichment at an even steadily growing pace is a red line for Israel. Israel is not going to sit and let that happen in the long run. So that's hugely worrying. Internally in Iran, there's also a lot of stake. I mean, as you know, there's been this balance of powers and forces inside Iran, which goes back for as long as the Republic has been there. There's been internal factions advocating for different lines, both internally and externally. And the real threat now is that you maybe for the first time, I think, in history of the Islamic Republic, can get like a sort of consolidation of all branches of the state in the hands of hardliners, because hardliners are currently in control of the parliament. They already control of the deep state, everything related to security and armed forces. Now, the only thing remaining, in a sense, is the presidency. So if you get a hardliner winning in the presidency, then you may, I mean, because this is not for sure, but you may see a different kind of Iranian regime that you have previously seen, a more really hardline regime with the counter forces which there have been there over the time will decrease their influence, which also can create a new set of problems. And of course, in terms of the internal population struggle for democracy, that's also not good news. And we have seen over the past years huge protests, like November 2019, widespread countrywide protests that were repressed very harshly, and things like this could increase as well.
Mr. Erdogan is also in big trouble and is really weakened, Pinar. You described that the problems with the economy, of course, and COVID, and this AKO party, this kind of fragmentation. And then we have the Kurds. We have the Kurds problem with the PKK, and also the situation in Syria. This has been troublesome for many years. Why can't Turkey handle the Kurds? Can you explain that for me?
$1 million question. Why can't Turkey handle? Indeed, I mean, the Kurds are the Achilles heel of the Turkish state, in the sense that it is always, the reason for entering into Syria, making these cross-border interventions were so publicly criticized, was this fear of Kurdish autonomy and a Kurdish belt against the border of Turkey. In actual fact, in 2012, there was a process that was between the AKP government and the Kurds in Turkey. And there was a lot of hopes linked to that process. And in fact, one of the key Kurdish politicians at the time said, if anyone can resolve this, it's Erdogan, because he was in a position of power and had such strong support that if he was able to resolve it, then it would be resolved once and for all. However, that fell through. And then we had everything that happened with the Gulen movement and the purges, and the history followed. But if Turkey could resolve the Kurdish issue, it would, in essence, not find its hands tied in the same way that it is, because it is the one existential threat that keeps coming back. And of course, for the nationalists, it's also very useful to have the Kurdish issue as a point around which to mobilize national sentiment. So discussions right now are near impossible because the nationalists really do run Erdogan and not the other way around, actually. And what's just recently this week, they're discussing closing the HDP party, which is the Kurdish-run, quite liberal and legitimate party within Turkey. If they do so, it's also one of the biggest opposition parties to the AKP, of course. So there are reasons for why one would want to close that if one was Erdogan. But it doesn't make the situation any better. And how does one resolve this? I think you need to have, first of all, a change in the rhetoric around the Kurdish issue, desecuritizing it, speaking about it as a political issue. I think that's extremely critical. That's not happening now. Now we have this nationalist fervor across Turkey, so it's impossible to talk about it in terms that would lead to a political solution. So you would need to have a change in the rhetoric and probably a change in the government as well to be able to talk about it. What's interesting and also worrying is that a lot of this rhetoric is also being adopted by opposition parties that, like the CHP, they're not particularly open to discussing the issues with the Kurds. So it's a real problem for Turkey, and it is the Achilles heel.
Thank you. We have a big audience, and they have sent us some questions, some of them. So I just ask a few of these questions, and you could answer all of you or one of you. It's up to you. One is like this: did the Trump administration do anything good in the MENA region?
It's a resounding silence.
If I could comment, I would say possibly, maybe not. it's what is being hailed. I mean, in the U.S. is the so-called what's it called, Abraham Agreement, the opening up of relations between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain with Israel, which is being sort of hailed as a reconciliation between Israel and the Arabs. But I think this is it's very little worth in terms of reconciliation between Israel and the Arabs, because the conflict was never between Israel and those states. They are peripheral to Arab society, and they are, of course, they did this, or the Americans pushed this at the same time as they more or less supported Israel taking over the West Bank and destroying any option for a two-state solution, which by the way might be that anyway. But so I think, and in other ways, of course, also we remember that Trump talked about Sisi as his favorite dictator, the current ruler in Egypt. So I think that the Trump period was a time when, I mean, nothing much happened in either direction, I would say, but to the extent that they had an influence, it was negative.
If I can add to that, I think I'm slightly more positive to the Abraham Accords, in the sense that I think it's a good thing that Israel and some Arab countries can have relations, although I see all the strategic thoughts that lie behind it. What I think is more worrying, and in a sense supporting Bjørn Olav's argument, is that they were able to make the Abraham Accords by hyping the Iranian threat. So kind of we have to make this agreement because we have this common enemy, Iran. So that was what brought these countries together, enabled these flourishing relations. And then in a sense you're creating some agreements that moves the Israeli-Arab relations overall, I would say, somehow closer, which I think is a good thing. But at the price of, even more polarizing the conflict with Iran, which is bound to create even more problems for the very same region. So it's a mixed picture.
Thank you. Pinar, would you add something? Or
no, I would just like to say that, what Trump did do, which wasn't positive, of course, was to support these very authoritarian leaders and to assist in the military buildup in the region at a time when it absolutely did not need it. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now.
A question for you, Pinar. How has the Arab Spring and the rise of IS impacted the Turkish-Kurdish relationship?
The Turkish-Kurdish relationship. Well, Turkey has been more concerned about the rise of the YPG and the PYD, in fact, in Syria than ISIS. And so in that extent, Turkey has focused much more on trying to contain that threat than to contain the threat that ISIS presented. And we saw this in 2014 when they intervened because of the Kurdish threat rather than because of the threat from the so-called Islamic State. And also, there have been terrorist threats in Turkey and terrorist events that have occurred, particularly around 2015 to 17. And these were terrorist attacks that occurred because of ISIS. But the perception in the public is that the real threat comes from the Kurdish insurgency. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, if I understand it correctly, but that's sort of that link between the two.
There's one question here for Kjetil. Do you believe that there are benefits of designating the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization?
No, I don't. I think it's kind of symbolic measure, which is making things more complicated, really, because it's it's a part of this Iranian state. It's an important part of the Iranian state, and by calling it a terrorist organization, you're just making any kind of engagement more difficult. I mean, it's just a wrong way of fighting the Revolutionary Guards. It's just a wrong way of supporting democracy in Iran, in my opinion, because democracy in Iran is never going to be imposed from the outside. It only will emerge from the inside. So the more you polarize around this issue, turning the Revolutionary Guard into a martyr of some sort because they're being called terrorists from the outside, the more difficult it becomes. It was the same thing with Houthis, and one of the last things the Trump administration did was designating the Houthis a terrorist organization, which is also like a non-starter for anything like a resolution of the Yemeni conflict. You have to, the Houthis are just, they're a very important factor. You have to engage with them. You have to deal with them. If you just call them a terrorist, it just means you cannot touch them. You cannot talk to them. So it's not going to work. And now Biden recognized that. So one of the first things he did was, saying we remove this terrorist organization of the Houthis, hoping that would be a goodwill measure to Iran that would kind of be met with some kind of response, positive engagement from Iran, which has so far not materialized. But he has so far not turned away from this designation of the Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization.
The time is running out, and we have just 2 seconds left. So thank you very much for your participation. It's been very stimulating, at least for me. I just have one sentence from the Arab Barometer, a survey that trying to find out the support of democracy in this region. And that says that just 2 years ago, that 78% of the Tunisians and 70% of the Egyptians and 70% of the Libyans said that democracy is the best option for their countries. There is no figure for Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, but still, I think there is some hope there too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.